so that we don't hear the background noise. And perhaps consider putting in the chat your name and where you are located in the United States so that our guest speakers have a good sense of who's in the audience. And if you want to include your pronouns, that is a practice that is popular with UUs and at UUSJ. If you have a land acknowledgement that you would like to include, please feel free to do that. And we'll be starting in a few minutes. And again, I'll just ask folks to put themselves on mute. Please know that we will be recording.
It's 7 o'clock.
So welcome again. I'm asking folks to put themselves on mute so that you don't hear things like the alarm going off in my child's bedroom right now. And we're going to get started in a minute. Please put into the chat your name, where you're from, pronouns, perhaps land acknowledgement. We're about to get started. Paula, can you show the next slide? So as we get started here, I just want to remind folks that UUSJ, our purpose, our vision is to have a just, compassionate, and sustainable world community. Our mission, our new mission as of earlier this year is to advance equitable national policies and actions aligned with UU values through engagement, education, and advocacy. So tonight's briefing is part of our effort to engage you and prepare you to engage your elected officials, to educate you and prepare you to do some advocacy. We're here to learn and discern, and we ultimately are interested in using that education to mobilize folks on behalf of voting rights tonight. So that is the central purpose of our event here tonight. And I'm gonna ask for the next slide. Just a quick overview. I'm doing the short welcome, and in a few moments, I'm gonna kick it over to Reverend Karen Scrivo, and she's gonna light the chalice for us and open a sacred space. The USJ is in fact a faith-based advocacy organization, and so it's important for us to anchor and ground everything that we do in our sacred tradition. Our speakers this evening are Andrea Miller of the Center for Common Ground, Sister Quincy Howard of Faithful Democracy, Donna Scheid of UU Church of Greensboro, and Fred Van Dusen of First Parish in Concord. And I'll tell you a little bit more about them as each one of them is joining us. With that, I want to honor everyone's time, and I'm gonna ask Reverend Scrivo to please light the chalice for us.
Unmute. Good evening. It's so good to be with you. I don't know about how your day was, but mine was pretty hectic, and I'm feeling a little frazzled, and maybe you are too. So I ask that we together take a couple of deep breaths to center ourselves and also to think about what we need to leave behind and drop so that we can be truly present with each other and with our material today. So breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. I'm going to light our chalice today with words from my dear colleague, Reverend Teresa Soto. I'll light the chalice first and then share her words with you. This is from one of her readings called Blessed Are the Hungry. I know that you are hungry for justice, and sometimes when you fail, it feels like the times when you open the refrigerator door, look inside, and close it, nothing having met your appetite. But there is always trying again. There is the fact that just one act is a beginning, and together we can build another. The gnawing hunger for a different future is one that we feed in the present. Your diligence, your tenacity, your willingness to learn, not just know, but also do. Hunger shaping how you nourish, feeding one another with the long spoons of your compassion until you're strong enough to feed the part of the world that you can reach. May it be so. Just wanted to quickly remind us of some of the spiritual grounding for our work as Unitarian Universalists. You might be familiar with some of the material that UU The Vote put out last year during their campaign. And this is from one of their toolkits. They say our justice work and engagement is guided by our values. Interdependence. We believe all life is sacred and interconnected, and that human beings are radically dependent on one another and our precious earth and its creatures. Democracy. We believe decision-making must ensure that all communities are heard, especially those who have been historically silenced. We believe all people have the right to elect leaders and shape policies that directly affect the quality of their lives and access to resources. Inherent worth and dignity across difference. We believe that people are all born from love and that nothing can separate them from their inherent belovedness. We believe in this inherent worth of all people, of all races, genders, abilities, sexualities, nationalities, and religions should be mirrored in societies, structures, and institutions, and the policies that shape their lives. Pluralism and diversity. We believe in the teachings of natural science that demonstrate the richest and healthiest ecosystems are those with the greatest diversity and self-determination and human agency. We believe that each person is an expert in their own experience and should have access to the conditions that ensure lives of belonging, safety, wellness, and joy. We believe that we must dismantle any system, structure, or policy preventing people from making decisions about their own lives or assessing what they need to be free and whole. May we work to make it so.
Amen. Amen. And thank you so much, Reverend Karen, for your grounding your leadership with UUSJ over the years, helping us to strive to remember the sacred and understand where our roots actually hold us in this work. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Andrea Miller, member of the Board of Directors for Center for Common Ground. She's a founding board member, executive director for People Demanding Action, founding president of the National Women's Political Caucus of Virginia, founding tri-chair of the Virginia Poor People's Campaign, and a member of the Democracy and Government's Working Group of the Virginia Green New Deal. Among UUs, she is best known for our joyful participation in Reclaim the Vote, her brainchild. And we are deeply, deeply pleased to have her. Our website includes her full bio, which is wonderful, and I encourage you to take a detailed look at it. But I want to get out of the way of her brilliance and her wonderfulness. And so I'm just gonna invite Andrea to teach, preach, or just get real with us.
Pablo, thank you so very much for the invitation to join your group tonight and be a part of this, because the UUs have been such an integral part of Reclaim Our Vote. So I bet a lot of people were going, Center for Common Ground, what on earth is that? And then as soon as they do the Reclaim Our Vote, like, oh, why didn't you say that in the beginning? So yes, Reclaim Our Vote. And I want to make sure you know what you were a part of in 2020 with Reclaim Our Vote. Reclaim Our Vote sent 9.4 million postcards to voters of color across 10 different states. We help voters get re-registered to vote. Voters pledge to vote and do more. And then we also sent GOTV postcards. We postcarded the community of color voters in the great state of Georgia twice. Once for the main election in 2020, and then we went back again for the runoff election in 2021. And as history has shown, we made a difference. So thank you all very much. I've been tasked with talking about the quest, the fight, the work for voting rights. So I always start whenever I get an opportunity to open up about voting rights, is that the notion of the right to vote is really and truly a misnomer in the United States. Voting is a privilege that many of us enjoy. We have the ability to vote, but we do not have the right to vote, as is evidenced so many times in our history. At the end of the Civil War, when Black men, not women, but men were given the quote, right to vote, we immediately saw states begin to make moves so that it would be impossible for people to exercise their ability to vote. Because if it were truly a right, then there would be no stopping it. We thought our work was done in 1965 when we passed the Voting Rights Act, and we actually set up policies and procedures so that states that deliberately discriminated against people because predominantly and primarily because of their race, they weren't going to be able to do that anymore. We thought we had won. And we didn't realize we had stopped too soon. And when Shelby versus Holder finally burst onto the scene and kind of burst our bubble and shone a light through the giant hole of democracy, people were like, oh, we thought we were done, but we were out of that space of mobilizing. And that's really what we're working on tonight. We are getting ready and we are mobilizing. We have been mobilizing like we literally haven't mobilized since the 1960s, because after the election on January 5th, we witnessed something in America that we thought could never happen, the insurrection of January 6th. And while we were still reeling from the pain of what happened on January 6th in Georgia, the legislature went into session on January 13th. Actually, two legislatures went into session on January 13th. We had the Georgia legislature and the Virginia legislature. They're both early legislatures. In Virginia, we saw the promise of what democracy could look like in a southern state when Virginia threw off her shackles as the former capital of the Confederacy and said, you know what? We are really going to begin making voting something that's easy to do in Virginia. So Virginia said, we've never had early voting before, but now we're going to have 45 days of early voting. In Virginia, we never had Sunday voting before. We're now going to say counties that want to have voting on Sunday, you can have Sunday voting. And in Virginia, we said, you know what? The United States no longer really and truly has a working Voting Rights Act. So Virginia, we are going to create a Voting Rights Act in Virginia. And then at the same time, we watched the great state of Georgia, where we had just witnessed a resounding victory where people came out and voted who hadn't voted in years, and they voted. And all of a sudden now, we saw laws being introduced, 41 in total, that were designed to deliberately make it harder to vote for the people that had just voted. They voted in a pandemic. We had rural, older, Black voters who had always gone to the polls because they had fought and died for the right to walk in those doors. Finally have to admit that in 2020, it wasn't safe to go into the doors. So they were going to have to vote another way. And they did. So on the backdrop of all that promise in Virginia, we watched the unraveling of everything that we have worked for. But then we saw Congress begin to say, okay, we see what is going on in the states. We see the states are trying to bring back this whole collection of power for the few rather than the many. And so the House of Representatives and the Senate introduced For the People Act. And we were waiting, are they going to bring us the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? And they're like, yes, it's coming. And then they introduced statehood for the 712,000 citizens of DC. And so right now, where we are poised today, we are in the middle of a giant mobilization. And this whole wheel of democracy is starting to grind and it's moving forward. We are looking at the For the People Act to set the standards for the present. And we are looking at the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to literally guide us and say what we saw in the states in 2021. That will not happen again. We will indeed begin to protect the ability to vote. We are still working toward a new constitutional amendment that says anyone who is of United States citizen and of voting age shall have the ability, because it is so important, to vote in any election held in the jurisdiction in which they reside. That's where we're ultimately need to go. And I am delighted to see that we are on our way there. We are correcting the mistakes, the omissions we made in the past, and we are working toward that bright future that we know is out there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for laying out and the context and really helping us to understand what is at stake and where we have come from in this struggle for voting rights. I deeply, deeply appreciate your wisdom. Next, I'm going to ask that Sister Quincy Howard, Coordinating Director of Advocacy for Faithful Democracy, speak to us. As many of you know from our plentiful emails about voting issues, we are a member of Faithful Democracy, and some of you have even suggested that Sister Quincy is a member of our organization and a UU. That's how much some of you have come to recognize her name and the great work that she has done. She is extremely humble, I will say, and ask me not to refer to her as an expert, but frankly, she is an expert. And I want to honor her brilliance in leading a multi-faith effort that brings in secular partners to the work that we've been doing by calling her such. She is an expert in my book, in my good book, in any case. So Sister Quincy Howard serves as the Coordinating Director of Advocacy, Outreach, and Campaigns for Faithful Democracy Coalition. She also works as the government relations team at Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice in Washington, D.C., which advances Network's access to democracy agenda with congressional lawmakers and their staff. And she is one of my go-to speed dial people when I have a question and need a clarification and don't want to embarrass myself in front of you or a member of Congress or one of their staff. So please, with warmth, let us welcome Sister Quincy Howard.
Thank you for those gracious words, Pablo. UU has been such a wonderful partner. UUA and UUSJ have just been along our side since really Faithful Democracy sort of got its sea legs a couple of years ago. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that although Andrea is an amazing storyteller, she is also an expert and is even more in the weeds on policy than I am. She just has her storytelling to shine even brighter. It's always a joy to be with Andrea. So I think what makes sense for me here is to talk a little bit about the two bills that are short of a constitutionally guaranteed right to vote, but try to at least guarantee freedom to vote for Americans that are currently moving through Congress, that are really pivotal for us at this point in this fight, at this sort of historical moment that Andrea so well laid out. And people often aren't sure what the difference is, but there is a very key difference between these two bills, and they do different things, and they are both critical for moving forward. So we have, on the one hand, we have, as Andrea mentioned, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is really a continuation of the oh my gosh, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so this is really just restoring the full oversight and protections of the Voting Rights Act after that Shelby ruling that she mentioned. And the other bill that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, because there's a lot happening right now, is the For the People Act was the original name of the bill, although we now have a new iteration of the bill, which I'll talk a little bit more about, which we also fully support. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the difference in these bills so that you yourselves can distinguish between them as you're sort of hearing about the democracy and voting rights realm. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is, I'm going to use a metaphor I think that's the best way to describe the difference. So I've heard two metaphors used that I thought were very helpful. One of them was if we have voter suppression compared to the coronavirus, COVID-19, not to get controversial on you, but let's say this is the metaphor that we're using. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would be the equivalent of wearing a mask, right? It is a shield in the most immediate way from the harmful effects of what that virus can do and the impacts it can have. And the For the People Act would be more akin to the vaccine. So it is laying a foundation of immunity from those harmful effects from the virus. The other metaphor that I've heard used, which I think is helpful, although not as nonviolent, is that the Voting Rights Advancement Act could be the equivalent of a shield if you are in battle against voter suppression, to shield from the most harmful impacts and the blows as they come. And the For the People Act would be like a proactive sword where you can move your way into enemy territory, right? And sort of take your space there. So the way that I'll sort of lay them out is, first of all, what is at stake? And we have our 2022 election coming up. If something is not passed on a federal level, the 2022 election is likely to be very fraught with issues. We saw what happened in 2020. And we can see that all of those underlying issues, the issue of the big lie, the issue of undermining people's confidence and of restricting people's rights to vote or freedom to vote, those are all still in play. And in many states, they are actually gaining traction, sadly. So what happens in 2022 could very well be determined by what happens with federal legislation in the coming months. And the other sort of critical thing that is at stake right now is the redistricting process, which has started in earnest. The data was released in August, and there are some states that are in full swing gerrymandering their districts as well as they possibly can with all of the capacity that big data brings into the picture these days. And that's going to lay the groundwork, potentially a hyper-partisan, divisive groundwork for the next decade. So I hope that those two things together help you understand the gravity of what is at stake. It could potentially be the long-term well-being of our democratic systems. That's not even touching on the dark money and the influence of money in politics, which is also quite honestly reaching a tipping point of undoing the democratic systems that we all depend on. So both of these bills, to give you a state of play where they have both passed in the House. And the John Lewis Act passed more recently, just in mid-August. And for the first time, it passed purely along partisan lines. So that is an indicator of the reality that we are all working in Washington, D.C. You all are well aware. It is divided. And the For the People Act actually passed back in May in the House, also along partisan lines, and has been sitting in the Senate, and they've been unable to move the bill because of the Senate rule that is the filibuster, which you all have heard so much about. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the For the People Act, because as I mentioned, that one is really hot right now. And when I say hot, I mean, I told you it's been stuck in the Senate. And a lot of that stuckness has been due to Senator Manchin. You all, this is probably not news to you. And Senator Manchin was the only Democratic senator that had not co-sponsored the legislation, even though when it was originally introduced in 2019, he was a co-sponsor. So that is a critical point. When you have a Senate that is split 50-50, you have to have all of the one or the other party, if it's going to be divided, on board with a path forward. And so what Senator Manchin has done, we're very pleased, and we are supporting him in his approach at this point, is he has worked closely with the senators that came up with the For the People Act, the original sponsors, the authors, many of our advocacy partners, to craft an iteration of the bill that he is going to make another last-ditch effort to get support on the other side of the aisle for what is now called the Freedom to Vote Act. It was introduced yesterday, so this is a very, very new development. And while most of our advocacy partners are still pouring through the legislation itself, it is very promising. It is a very robust version of the For the People Act, and it appears that everyone is getting on board to support this bill to move forward, whether or not it is able to garner bipartisan support. So to give you an idea what is in the Freedom to Vote Act, I'm going to go very high level, because this is like the ACA of democracy reform, right? This is a massive, comprehensive democracy reform legislation that gets at voting rights, that gets at election security, that gets at money in politics, gerrymandering, disclosure, and ethics. So it's got something for everyone in it. And I would add that all of the buckets of reform, you can see them represented in the new Freedom to Vote Act. So the first one I want to talk about is the access to the ballot in the Freedom to Vote Act. So the approach, I mentioned the sort of the sword metaphor and the vaccination metaphor. The way that translates into policy in this case is that the Freedom to Vote Act really does its best to lay a baseline expectation for everyone across the nation, no matter where you live, your zip code, to lay a foundation of access to the ballot that everyone can anticipate. So all of these variations between states that you heard Andrea allude to earlier, between Virginia going in one direction, Georgia going in the opposite direction, this would make sure that whatever direction you're going in, there's always that baseline standard of access. And those are really based on best practices, like, for example, a guaranteed 15 days early voting, online voter registration for everyone. Another one that is just near and dear to my heart, and I was so glad to see it was kept in this new iteration, is restoring the freedom to vote to formerly incarcerated citizens that have been released from prison. And let's say the election day becomes a holiday so that everyone theoretically has that day free to go cast their ballots. And there's all kinds of really juicy best practices that have been worked into the voting portion of the Freedom to Vote Act that were also mirrored in the For the People Act. The other one that I want to mention, a part of which is a new addition with this iteration that is really critical at this time, is under their election integrity section, which gets a lot at sort of the infrastructure, the voting machines, the paper ballots, the auditing systems, and also administration. So making sure that there is nonpartisan training for those that are election administrators, all of the things you would want to see as sort of the way our system works, right? But one that is critical that they have included is some preventative protections against election subversion. Election subversion are the kinds of tactics that we've been seeing in Arizona, where they are going after the results of an election and how those are tabulated to try to make that a partisan process, which is really a new thing in the United States, right? This is a new form of attack, and we are very pleased to see that they have rolled that up into this iteration of the For the People Act. Another thing that is in there that gets to the influence of money in politics has to do with disclosure requirements for dark money, as well as transparency requirements for things like online political advertising. You have your TV commercials that have a certain standard of transparency, but when you see something when you're surfing the web, you don't know how it got there, why you're seeing it, who put it there, you don't know anything about it. So it would apply those standards across the board. So people will know who's trying to influence their vote. That's a pretty critical piece of information, right? Another thing that it includes that, as I alluded to earlier, is critical, is it would implement independent redistricting committees in all states for the U.S. House of Representatives. So this is taking it out of the hands of whatever legislature is in power. We know that Democratic legislatures, as well as Republican legislatures, have really abused the redistricting process in many states in their favor so that they would be guaranteed to win re-election. Not only does this set up a process for independent redistricting committees, but it has an outright ban on partisan gerrymandering, which is huge. That's a huge protective mechanism that I can't really stress enough, and would be applied to the new districts drawn for the 2022 election. And then finally, I want to highlight the Federal Election Commission, which is sort of the oversight body for elections and campaigns to make sure that everyone is playing above board. The FEC would be empowered with all kinds of new oversight and enforcement responsibilities to make sure that they, number one, have a quorum and can function, because they haven't in years. And number two, would be empowered to enforce breaches in things like campaign finance law. So as you can gather, this is a very broad piece of legislation that we're talking about. And so we have this legislation. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is on a little bit of a longer timeline. It hasn't formally been introduced in the Senate. And we have yet to find out if we will be able to garner any Republican support for that bill. That is still a question that we are praying on, and welcome any prayers in that direction. And then we have the Freedom to Vote Act, which, as I mentioned, was just introduced yesterday. So to give you an idea what we are anticipating on that bill, because it is crunch time, is that as early as next week, Schumer has said this bill could come to a vote on the floor in the Senate. We are super pleased at that news, because he's been making this commitment consistently since the spring. And what we have seen, which is not always the case for politicians, is that he has been consistently following through with these commitments as well. He said that this would be a priority when they came back from recess. And what we learned yesterday is that during recess, Senator Manchin and these other senators had been working diligently to craft this new piece of legislation so that they could bring it anew and try to get some Republican support on the bill. That is what Manchin is currently doing. He's shopping it around. We don't have high hopes that he is going to get any takers, especially with some of the comments coming from the ranking member McConnell about sort of just a full-throated no, we're going to uniformly block this bill. So next week, when it comes to a vote, we anticipate that it will be filibustered. Just like the For the People Act was filibustered back in June, this bill will also be filibustered, meaning that Republicans don't even want to give it the time of day to talk about any of the very critical reforms that are included. And it's at that point that really the pressure is going to be on in the Senate to do something about the filibuster. We at Faithful Democracy, we're not prescribing what they need to do, eliminate, reform. Really, it's neither here nor there to us from a democracy perspective, but they need to remove that barrier because it's not constitutionally based to pass a bill. And it has a very racially problematic and fraught history of its use in the Senate. And we cannot have a procedural rule in the Senate prevent these kinds of foundational and critical reforms from passing and becoming law, especially when the threats, as Andrea so eloquently laid out, are so real and are such a present danger. So that is I think that covers what I thought would be the best to share with folks at this time. And I understand we'll have question and answer, so I'm happy to engage there too.
So thanks again to Andrea and to Sister Quincy for being your wonderful, beautiful, brilliant selves, your expert selves. And now I'm deeply pleased to invite Donna Scheid to speak to us. She is one of our UU stars. And if you are not aware of who Donna is, then this is a great moment to be proud of the excellent work that UUs in congregations, in community, can do working across silos. You don't have to have a collar. You don't have to be in a position like mine. You do have to care and put shoulder to the work. And Donna has done that. So let's hear from Donna. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pablo, for that introduction. I don't know about you all, but my hand is tired from taking notes. I have been taking notes furiously as both Andrea and Sister Quincy have been filling us in on what's happening. It's hard to keep up with this all. I just feel so honored to have these two incredible individuals in the room with us. As Pablo mentioned, I'm a member of the UU Church of Greensboro in Guilford County, North Carolina. And I'm also a middle-aged, white, highly educated, professional working person whose first and predominant language is English. I am a US born citizen who periodically experiences disability issues that affect my mobility. Now, I'm telling you all this not just to let you know who I am, but because these are important to my opportunities to exercise my right to vote, often as a result of unfair and unjust laws and policies related to voting. And my role tonight is not to give you the policy perspective per se, but just to give you a little bit of context for why I come to these issues. And so let me give you an example about this. One of the more salient features of my voting experience is where I live. I grew up in Omaha, Nebraska, and it's wonderful to have my high school teacher in the room tonight with us. A pleasant surprise. Thank you, Dave Richardson. But I'm here now in North Carolina in Guilford County, and Guilford County was once subject to preclearance under the Voting Rights Act, right up until the decision that Andrea mentioned earlier, the 2013 US Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder. I live in Jamestown, North Carolina, and there are a number of us North Carolinians in the room tonight, so it's good to see you all. I live in Jamestown, a small town just outside of Greensboro. It's a kind of suburban type area that Michael Lee of the Brennan Center has spoken about recently when he states, "Nowhere is the redistricting threat greater than in the suburbs of the South, where single party control of the map drawing process will combine with weakened legal protections to set the stage for an unprecedented shellacking of communities of color." That's 2021. He wrote that just within the last few weeks. In the last cycle of districting during the past 10 years, my districted representatives here in Guilford County, all three of them, state and federal, changed over. This was not because the members of my district and I had elected new representatives. Instead, the courts found that my district and surrounding districts had been illegally gerrymandered on the basis of race or extreme partisanship. In other words, districts were drawn so as to dilute votes on the basis of race or party and to preserve seats for incumbent politicians. Even today, after years worth of lawsuits, North Carolina remains the country's most gerrymandered state, according to the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. And maneuvers like this have real impact. So a recent study by the Brennan Center found that between 2012 and 2020, the gap in turnout between white voters and Black voters reopened in 5 of the 6 former preclearance states, that being Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, and Virginia. In Louisiana, South Carolina, and Texas, the 2020 gap was higher than it had been for the past 24 years. And in North Carolina, we experienced a widening of 14.7 percentage points, again, between the white and Black turnout rate, 2012 to 2020. It is for these reasons, among others, that we must pass the For the People Act, the Freedom to Vote Act, the iteration of it that Sister Quincy mentioned just a little bit ago, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and we must do so now. So I was thrilled in June, of course, of this year when delegates at the UUA General Assembly passed an action of immediate witness entitled Stop Voter Suppression and Partner for Voting Rights in a Multiracial Democracy. This action was drafted by me and a subcommittee within UUSJ's Democracy Action Team. It was submitted by a delegate and one of our own here at UUSJ, Julia Sales. The action received a ringing endorsement with 99% of delegates voting in approval. But even after the action's passage, I am left with a lingering question, which is this: how is the political activism that we do as UUs, faith-based or spiritually grounded work, different than our work with other organizations? In other words, what does it mean to advocate for voting rights, and these bills in particular, specifically as a UU? There are any number of answers to this question, and many of them were discussed at the UUA's recent Side with Love Action Center launch on Sunday. You may have your own. Perhaps your reasons for becoming politically involved as a UU have to do with bringing your values as a person of faith or spirit to your political work. And that, of course, isn't unique to UUs. Perhaps your reasons have to do with the ways that UU organizations, your congregation, UUSJ, the UUA, help you to articulate those values and frame the issues, providing ready paths for your energies in anxious time. Perhaps you enjoy working alongside others who share your most deeply held values, nurturing a sense of support and resilience in the work. These are all terrific reasons, but I want to focus specifically on spiritual practice and how making a political argument through a spiritual or faith-based lens is essentially a different kind of work. Because it is, even though I will struggle to describe it. Some of the greatest challenge in this work comes with making one's case to those with whom we disagree. And of course, they are all around us, including one of my senators, both of my senators actually on this issue. I understand what it means to try to transform law, policy, and practice, what it means to speak truth to power. It's of course part of our UU tradition, and we do so when it's called for. But I can do that in my individual capacity or through affiliation with a secular or partisan organization. The hard part for me is that other dimension of faith-based or spiritually informed political work, the part that has the potential to transform not just the law, but me. And among the things that I think this includes are persisting, even though it can feel futile, listening, finding hope, rather than falling into despair, and not just being right, but being in right relationship as you do the work. When she gave the sermon at church this last Sunday, our guest minister, the UU Reverend Patty Hanneman from Durham, North Carolina, called this the activism of cohesion. And she described this kind of activism in this sense: it's concerned with connection as well as correction. Connection as well as correction. Now, again, I, for one, struggle to do this work well, and there's very little to recommend it in our current age. I am fortunate to work through UUSJ with individuals who model the path of faith-based or spiritual political practice, and among those, the incredible individuals you've just heard from tonight, Andrea Miller and Sister Quincy Howard. I think our spiritual and faith-based work is some of the most important work we do as activists, and our action of immediate witness calls us to it, to the sacred work, to organize and activate our faith, as the document says, to call, write, witness, and advocate for relevant national legislation, including the For the People Act, now the Freedom to Vote Act, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Our action calls us to do this work in partnership denominationally, for example, with UUSJ and with others, federally. By the way, Sister Quincy calls for prayers, but she marches into the Senate offices as well, and we go with her. And also to work, of course, in conjunction with you at home, with your state action network or with your local congregation. And so I hope you join us now, and I invite you to consider some of the actions that are available to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. You once again show the power of the people when they put their minds to the good works that we need to get done. We're now going to transition into a short question and answer section. I see 3 questions in the chat that I think our 3 guests can perhaps tackle. I'm just going to put them out there and let them answer them as they feel called to do. The first question is, does the Freedom to Vote Act affect statewide elections, not just federal elections in all states? Does anyone know the answer to that?
Yeah, I can field that one. It is applicable to federal elections. So it does not affect how states conduct their own elections, but that is with the caveat that the assumption is that states will follow suit, because the practice of having different rules at a potentially different time could get very expensive and can be cost prohibitive and just problematic and confusing. So there is a huge amount of sway in saying how federal elections need to go down. And I would just add that Congress does have the power to do that constitutionally. It is just something that they have yet to exercise. And we believe that it is time that they begin to exercise that power that has explicitly been given to them by the Constitution.
Another question. Oh, someone want to say something?
I'm going to add just very, very quickly that there are really only 3 states that have major elections outside the federal cycle. That would be Virginia, New Jersey, and Louisiana. And Virginia is even talking about getting on the federal cycle. So we would really be looking at, if other states didn't want to comply, a very expensive, incredibly confusing and difficult process, as Quincy said.
This is a question that comes up frequently, so I'm gonna throw it to the panel. What is the best type of action if you're in a state where the senators and representatives are already supporting these bills, or at least seem to be supporting them? You have suggestions for what folks can do and what they should be doing?
Yeah, I've got suggestions. It makes it, you're not going to be the target maybe of the advocacy, but I can tell you that your senators in particular, even if they are both Democratic, any kind of pressure you can put on them to put pressure in turn on their Democratic colleagues to make sure that they are ready to do what it takes to move the filibuster out of the way as an obstruction. Because even if you have 2 senators that are progressive Democrats, they still can have conversations with their colleagues in the Senate to try to sway them and convince them that now is the time to really show bold leadership in order to pass this bill. So that would be my suggestion. And in the House, if you have a Democratic representative in the House, we don't know if this is going to go back to the House for a vote, how it will be conferenced, how this will move forward. But I would encourage you to applaud them and to tell them they did the right thing, encourage them to continue supporting the bill in its entirety, just to make sure that they don't get cold feet.
Thank you. Another question is, what can we do to engage with impacted communities around voting rights at the level of the community or the state?
Andrea, you got this one, girl.
All right, I'm back. When you want to help engage with impacted communities, the new term is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. That is really what my organization, and there are other organizations where this is what we do. So normally before an election, we work with, and this is really going to be important until we get these new laws in place. Georgia dumped 112,000 people off the voting rolls. So we're going to have to make sure those 112,000 people who got dumped off the voting rolls know that they were dumped off and know how to get back on. So this is always where and how we start, since we work almost exclusively in southern states all along the southeast, and then we swing up into Texas and Arizona, states that have large community of color populations. These are, of course, always the first people dumped off the voting rolls. These are always the first people where, if they're going to close polling locations, they're going to get closed in their neighborhoods. So this is where we specialize, in making certain that voters have the information they need to be able to go out and vote.
Thank you so much. With that, we, as Unitarian Universalists, we want to try and live our values. So I'm going to kick it over to Fred Van Dusen, who is our Democracy Action Team convener. He is the person who helps me find wonderful folks like Donna and Ursula and Julia and others, and keep everybody like moving in the right direction, moving in a direction for impact. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about what we can do as UUs to engage on these issues. Fred, thank you so much.
Thanks, Pablo. After hearing from all these excellent speakers, you all did a wonderful job. Thank you. I'm assuming you're ready to take some action. Hopefully the 100 and some people are ready to do something. So I'm going to briefly review what it takes to organize a Right Here, Right Now event for your congregation. Give you a chance to try out our online letter writing platform, and finally talk about some other actions you can take in support of our freedom to vote. So let me start with the Right Here, Right Now handout, and I'm going to share my screen. All right, hopefully you can all see that. So this document's intended to be given to the people who will be writing letters to their US senators and representatives. As you can see at the top, it has a brief call to action, which highlights that we're really talking about the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and encouraging our leaders to pass the bills and not let the filibuster rules prevent them from passing. So it really sets up pretty clearly what we're trying to get the writers to do. We've this format, it's changed a little bit from the previous ones that were done. We tried to make it a little more crisp, a little clearer, and tried to reduce the amount of writing and also focus on what they need to do at the top. So that's what we've tried to do. It covers our basis, our UU grounding, why this is important to UUs. Talks about the new restricted voting laws and a little bit of explanation of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And time is of the essence. So it really is just some key points quickly. And then there's a sample letter that people would send to their senators. And we asked to customize it to include their own personal experience, a story of something, or how they feel about something, particular issues. And there are a number of different ways that you do this right here, right now. The simplest approach is basically to place it in your congregation's newsletter and ask members to click on a link and write a letter using online letter writing platform. So that's the easiest thing you can do. You get more of a social event and invite people to a Zoom meeting to write letters together. Or you ask them to actually have an in-person event. That's what we used to do all the time. And give them basically some paper and pen, and they would handwrite their letters right there, usually at coffee hour or something like that. It's a little harder to do that now, but maybe it will get easier. In any event, those are sort of 3 different ways you can do it. We also have a sample announcement you could customize for your newsletter, and I'll put a link for that. We have the online letter writing platform. At this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to put something in the chat. And I want you all, hold on here. To click on that link. So in the chat, if you can find it, there's a link to our online letter writing platform. So there are some 100 people on the call. I'm hoping you can all do this. So let me look at the group. Have you been able to do this? People there? Thumbs up, yes, no, able to do the link?
Yes.
Very good. All right, so go to it. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes to use the platform and write a letter to your senators. So please complete the form and edit the letter, sample letter as you see fit. When you're done, click on the Take Action button, and the letter will be sent to both of your senators. I know it only shows one picture, one of the senators, but there's 2 dots. If you click on the second dot, you'll see your other senator. So when you click the Take Action button, it will go to both senators. So please start doing that. And when you're done, I have a request for you. There's something called reactions in Zoom. And when you're done, raise your hand. So that would look like that, or something else, or thumbs up, or whatever suits your fancy. So I'll give you a couple minutes and then I'll show you some more stuff.
I have to say that I live in Washington, DC, so I don't have senators. Just wanted to point that out to folks.
I'm sorry. There's another opportunity. We'll cover that one. That will be a true sign of our democracy having worked when DC is a state.
Also, Fred, I would just like to remind people, just because your senator is a Democrat and a sponsor, that doesn't mean that they have gone along with the notion of dealing with the filibuster. So it's important to put those 2 together.
Yeah, and it's important to get, even if they're positive about both things, it's still important to reinforce that and to encourage them to do it. So how are people doing on filling out the form and the letter? Still going?
Yes.
I'll give you a couple more minutes. Well, my first group of people seems to be doing quite well here. All right. If you haven't finished, please do that when you get a chance. I'm going to share one more screen with you and a link. Hold on a second. Let me give you a link to this too. You get that.
Speak to the phone call question.
Go for it, Sister Quincy.
I would recommend, I mentioned that the Freedom to Vote Act is likely to come to a vote either next week or the week after. I'm sure that you will be notified when that's going to happen, but in any way that you can call your senators before the vote as well as after the filibuster, that would be really powerful, and let them know that you're calling back because you know it happened and it's time to take the next step.
Yeah, contact them the way that you can by any means. So what I've got here on the share, are some other things you can do. So I've got the links to the right here, right now resources, out the sample announcement, the online letter, this platform that you're using. The other thing that we're doing is we're going to be meeting with senators. And if you happen to be in a state where we have a meeting, we'd certainly like you to come. And if you're interested in doing that, please fill out the meeting interest form. And as it says, we're particularly interested in people who live in states with moderate senators from either party, but we do talk with others as well. So if you're interested in participating in one of our meetings, they're all done via Zoom. They're a half hour long, and it's basically with the staff, one of the staff members of the Senate, the senators. So then I have a bunch of other things that you can do. So on Friday, there's a Finish the Job rally all over the country. So if you click on that link, you can get to it. So what I encourage you to do with that actions that I put in, that actions to take, click on that link. And then save it, save somewhere, so you'll have it. So you can do this, attend this rally. The Center for Common Ground, we heard from Andrea that they're writing postcards still, and there's lots of things available. I know we're doing them locally as well. Faithful Democracy has a Take Action page that has actions you can do. You can come in, you can get involved with our team. Our Democracy Action team is always looking for people to support us, join us, get on our mailing list for our discussion group. If you're interested, contact me or contact Pablo. The AIW, the Action of Immediate Witness that Donna mentioned, you can see that. There's a link to it. That's useful anytime this year. If you're trying to get a democracy event going, you can point to this Action of Immediate Witness since it ties right in. There's a link to DC statehood. So we've got an action alert for that. There's free, if you look at the Declaration for American Democracy site, there are lots of opportunities and they'll have them ongoing. And that's also true with Common Cause. Those two groups have a bunch of different actions pretty much all the time happening. And then you can organize your own meeting with a member of Congress. And we've got some instructions for how to do that. I had never done this before I got to the group, and I thought it was an impossibility, but now 30 meetings later, it's not so hard. But the instructions are pretty good, so it works. And finally, you can ask your friends and family members to contact their senators, and that can be a phone call, or they can use our letter writing platform. You can give them a link. They can obviously customize it if they're not UUs. So all of those things are options. So with that, I think I'm done here. Have you
Thank you so much, Fred. I sincerely appreciate your diligence and your leadership. And I want to thank our guests for being with us and staying with us. And at this point, I'm going to ask you, Fred, to stop sharing your screen and
Yep.
let us invite Reverend Karen Scrivo once again to close the sacred space for this sacred dialogue and discernment about what we can do. And then I encourage you to look at the materials that have been shared. I will answer the question. We are going to share the link to this video when we get it onto our YouTube channel. So thank you so much to the guest speakers for allowing us to record, because not every guest allows that. Reverend Scrivo?
Again, so good to be with you all. As I mentioned, I came here pretty frazzled and tired, and I leave rejuvenated and ready for action. So good to be with you all. I want to close with further words from my colleague, Reverend Teresa Soto, who is the senior minister at the UU Church in Oakland, California. And this comes from a collection of her meditations called Spilling the Light. This is a favorite of mine, and many of you may have heard it several times from me and others. It's called We Hold Hope Close. In this community, we hold hope close. We don't always know what comes next, but that cannot dissuade us. We don't always know just what to do, but that does not mean that we are lost in the wilderness. We rely on the foundation of our beliefs, values, and ethics. We are the people who return to love like a North Star, and in the truth that we are greater together than we are alone. Our hope does not lie in some glimmer of an indistinct future. Rather, we know the way to the world of which we dream, and by covenant and movement forward of one right action and then the next, we know that one day we will arrive home. May it be so. And with that, I extinguish our challenge.
So much, Reverend Karen. So this is the formal conclusion of our event tonight. I'll just answer